Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's up off the ground. After that, remove all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts. With the wheel out of the way, the next thing we're going to pay attention to is the caliper. What we want to do is use a small pry bar, and we're going to carefully get in between this area. I want to gently pry up against the forward aspect of the caliper and up against the rotor on the inside. Essentially what we're doing is pushing the caliper so we can push in the piston a little bit. Now once you feel as though you have some movement, we can continue on to our 2 caliper slider pins. To remove these bolts, let's go ahead and use a 14mm socket. We'll start up top. Once you have the top bolt loose, go ahead and fully remove the lower. Inspect all of your hardware as you remove it. Carefully slide the caliper out of position, and now you want to give it a quick inspection. If you see any fluid in this area, that means you have brake fluid leaking, in which case you would replace the caliper. Let's set this aside, putting no pressure on the flex hose. The reason why I went ahead and took the caliper off of the bracket is so I can thoroughly inspect the pads as we remove them. Now we can go ahead and grab onto these little clips right here. They should just want to pop right out of the pads. It's a good idea to give them a quick inspection, make sure they don't look broken or damaged or weak in any way. After that, go ahead and pop the pads out of the bracket. Give those an inspection as well. Now let's move along to our 2 caliper bracket bolts. For this, I'm going to use a 17mm. Remove your bracket, set it aside. Now let's just take one of our lug nuts. We're going to start it onto one of the lug studs. Now looking at the rotor where it mounts onto the hub, you're going to find 2 Phillips head bolts. There's one located right here, and then typically one directly across from it. To remove those, it's going to be easiest using an impact driver and a hammer. Break your rotor free from the hub. Remove your lug nut. Remove the rotor. Now let's move along to removing our 36mm axle nut. The next thing you're going to want to do is break the axle free from the hub. If yours doesn't move like ours does, you want to come right in the center right here with a punch and a hammer. Couple bonks, break it free. Make sure it can move, and then we can continue. Now let's go ahead and find that ABS sensor. We're going to remove our 10mm headed bolt. Let's find the area where the ABS wire connects onto the strut. We'll remove that 10mm headed bolt. Grab that bracket, it should come free. Now let's make our way up here to this mounting bolt. Let's Let's grab that bracket, we'll pull it away from the body. Now we're going to start separating the ABS wire. Looking at this, right up in this area, you can see that there's a squeeze tab. That'll lift up on this point and you should be able to separate it. Every time you disconnect an electrical connector, just take a peek. If you see any funny colors, it's probably corrosion, in which case it would need to be dealt with. This looks fine. Let's use a 12mm to remove the bolt that holds the flex hose to the strut. Now let's move along to removing the 2 bolts that hold the knuckle to the strut. For those, we're going to use a 19mm on the bolt side, which is the rear of this, and then a 22 to remove the nut from each. Let's start removing those bolts. Now let's carefully start pulling this down, making sure you're not putting a tug on the axle. Let's get the axle out of this area. Just set this aside. Now we're going to go ahead and start removing the ball joint nut. To do that, you're going to find that you have a locking pin. Just go ahead and find the hook that's on the locking pin, pull it to the side, and then slide the pin out of position. Give that a quick inspection, make sure it doesn't look worn or damaged in any way. Set it aside. Let's use a 17mm to remove the nut. After a quick inspection of the nut, it's a good idea to start it back on a couple threads. Now at this point, you're going to want to separate the joint. There's a couple different ways of doing it. I'm going to use a pickle fork. Okay. Now we can remove that nut. All right, now let's get this over to the press. Now over at the press, we're going to need to go ahead and press the hub out of the bearing. The hub is the area that has these lug studs on it. So as you can see, looking from the backside, you can see exactly the inner circle right here. That's considered part of the hub. This next ring right here is part of the bearing. So what we're going to have to do is put this into the press. And what I want to do is try to hold on underneath these ears on this side as support. And then along the other side, I'm going to try to get underneath this area, being very careful not to damage the backing plate. Once I have it supported, I'm going to find an adapter that fits directly over that hub. We'll put in a spacer. Make sure everything's as aligned as possible. Now with support underneath both sides of the bracket, we can continue on applying pressure. At this point, we have the hub out of here, and we can continue removing the bearing. The next thing that you're going to want to do is take off the snap ring. The snap ring is this area here. You can see that it has 2 little eyelets in it. To remove this, it's going to be easiest either using some snap ring pliers, or to even break it free, typically you might need to use a chisel or even a hammer. You can see it starting to pull away from the groove. If it feels as though it's sticking, just go ahead and spread it, and then get in between with a screwdriver or pry bar. We'll just carefully start prying this out of position. Now once you have your spring out of there, it's a good idea to go ahead and clean it off and give it a thorough inspection. You want to make sure it's still going to be reusable. If it seems like it's weak, you're going to want to replace it. Once you have your snap ring out of there, you're going to want to go ahead and clean it down and give it a thorough inspection. You want to make sure it's still strong and it's going to be able to hold the bearing in place in the knuckle. Now I went ahead and cleaned this up, and also when I did it, I went and beveled the edges along where the snap ring is going to go into the knuckle. Once you're sure the snap ring looks good, let's continue on back over at the press and get this bearing out of the knuckle. Now the areas that you want to press is just along this inner race right along here. You want to be extra careful not to damage the ABS sensor in any way. Once it looks as though it's lined up as straight as possible, go ahead and start applying pressure. There we are. At this point, it's started to break free. We're just going to continue driving this bearing down and out of the area, and then after that, we can give the knuckle a clear inspection. Go ahead and take a peek in here, make sure it's clean and free of any debris. Now that we have it apart, we can give it a closer inspection. The areas that you want to pay attention to is, of course, the area going all the way around where the bearing sits. You also want to make sure you pay attention to where that snap ring is going to be, which is along this area here. Typically, it's a good idea to take out any of the gunk or debris that might be in that area. Once you have all that cleaned up, you also want to pay attention along the backside here of the knuckle. Now, when you go ahead and press the bearing into there, it's going to be pressed directly up against that. So if you have any rust or debris in that area, it's going to cause an issue with the bearing installation. Go ahead and clean it up, and then we can get ready for our installation. Okay, friends, now it's time to get ready to install our brand new bearing. Taking a look at it, you can see one side has a magnet strip on it. The other side does not. We want to take the side that does have the magnet strip and have that facing towards where the ABS sensor is, so essentially inboard. So I'm just going to take it so the magnet strip is facing down. We'll put this into place. Now that I have this set on the knuckle where it's going to need to go, the next thing that I'm going to talk to you about is how to press this down. It's very important that you don't press on this center ring right here, or even the middle ring. The only place that you can press against to push this into the knuckle is the very outside ring. Now how are you going to do that? Just go ahead and take the original bearing that you just removed, put it right on top, making sure it's not touching either of these inner rings. After that, you should be able to press it right straight down. As you're pressing this down, you just want to stop every once in a while and double check to make sure it's going down completely straight. If it's sitting off kilter, it could potentially get bound up inside and you could potentially cause some serious damage. Okay, so right there I feel as though it kind of got a little bit harder to drive this down. That tells me that this should be essentially right up against the backside, but for good measure, I'm going to apply a little bit more pressure just to make sure it's completely bottomed out. All right, that feels as though it's nice and tight. Let's go ahead and release that pressure. The next thing we want to do is pay attention to the slot on the knuckle where the snap ring is going to be. You want to make sure the bearing's down low enough so that the snap ring can fit into place. If it isn't, the bearing needs to get driven down a little bit further. You'll probably notice that I removed the backing plate because ours was rotted. Let's get our snap ring into place. Once you feel as though you have it in place, you just want to double check. As you can tell on this one, it's not completely seated. It's very important to make sure you tap this into place all the way around. Back over at the press, let's take our hub. I'm going to set it down on something so it's pretty much holding on the center. Definitely not touching up against any of the studs. We'll get this in position so it seems as though it's aligned. Now we can go ahead and take the hub and bearing and we'll slide it right over this area. Make sure it's lined up. The next thing we want is something that presses directly up against this inside race. You don't want anything to touch up against the magnet. Let's apply some pressure. Now we can start pressing this down. The area that you want to pay attention to is in between this area. We're going to make sure that we have this bottomed out up against the bearing. Typically, as I do this, I try to spin this a little bit just to make sure that nothing's binding along the way. Okay, so right there, it just bottomed out. Just going to take it a teeny bit more, make sure it's completely seated. We're also spinning this to make sure it's not binding in any way. At this point, this feels good. Let's release pressure. Remove our tools. And now we can get back over to the vehicle. Let's get this back into the lower control arm. Now we can take the axle, we'll get that back into position as well. Once that's going through the inside of the bearing, let's go ahead and take this, line it up here, and grab those 2 bolts and slide them in through from the rear. Red thread locker. Start those nuts on there. Now we can bottom each of these out. Once you have them both bottomed out, torque each of them to 116 foot-pounds. Reinstall the lower ball joint nut. Once you bottom this out, torque this to 51 foot-pounds. Now we can torque this nut to 51 foot-pounds. After you have it torqued, the next thing you want to pay attention to is the slot that's on the nut in comparison to the hole that's on the ball joint stud. If it doesn't look like it's lined up, just continue tightening the nut until the very next slot does. Once it's lined up, put in your locking clip. Make sure it's secure. You'll notice with your kit, it came with a brand new axle nut. Go ahead and start that on by hand. We're going to bottom this out, get this closer to the ground, and then we can torque this to manufacturer's specification. With this closer to the ground, I took a pry bar and I went across the studs, being very careful not to damage them in any way. Now I can use my 36mm socket. We'll torque this to 181 foot-pounds. Now we're going to spin it so you can see the slot on the axle. That's a locking slot, so we're just going to take a hammer and a punch. We're going to come right in here and drive the edge of this in to the slot to lock it in position. There we are. Now let's apply some copper never sees to the hub. If you're going to be reusing your rotor, it's a good idea to make sure you clean the backside of the mating surface, the area that's going to go right up against that hub. Now we can get ready to put the rotor up on here, but first let's look at the hub. You can tell where we had our 2 mounting holes. Looking at the rotor, you want to make sure you have the 2 holes lined up as you install it. Once those are on there, reinsert your mounting screws. Give them a tap to lock them in. Let's carefully take that bracket. We're going to slide it in position over the rotor. We'll take our caliper bracket bolts. We'll slide those in. Start each of these in by hand, and then we'll snug them up and torque them to 80 foot-pounds. Now it's time to go ahead and install our brake pads. Looking at the brake pads, you want to find one that has the wear indicator and one that does not. We're going to take the pad that has the wear indicator and we're going to put it on the inboard side. As you can tell, I have the wear indicator facing upward. We'll go ahead and slide this right into position. Get that outer pad on there, same way. Make sure it moves. Now let's continue on pressing in that caliper piston. Just using my caliper compression tool here. Once the caliper looks as though it's completely compressed, let's continue on with a little bit more of that high temperature caliper lube. The areas that you're going to want to lubricate is the metal aspect of the piston. Also, go ahead and have a look at the other side of the caliper along each of these ears. Lubricating all this is going to help with vibration dampening and noise reduction. Now we can set this aside for 1 second. Now we can move up to this area right here. Let's put in our mounting bolt. Once it's in, just go ahead and snug it up. The next thing we're going to do is grab our springs, and for these you want to find the holes that are in each of the pads. We'll go ahead and slide them in there. Just keep in mind that that's going to try to spread the pads apart, so you need to hold them together while you continue. Now we can grab that caliper, we'll slide it into position. As you slide it into position, you can spin these caliper slider pins so they line up. There we are. Now we can grab our 2 caliper slider pin bolts. Spin your slider pins as needed. Once everything's lined up, go ahead and grab onto those 2 caliper slider pin bolts. Let's start both of those in by hand. We'll snug them up, and then we can torque these to manufacturer's specifications as well. Now we can torque each of these to 25 foot-pounds. Now we can go ahead and take that ABS wire. I'm going to bring this down and under here. And what we want to do is line it up with this bracket right here. Looking at the back of the bracket for the ABS wire, you can see that it has this little piston that comes shooting out, and it's right next to the mounting hole. You want to make sure that it lines up with this slot up along here, and of course the mounting hole lines up with its corresponding spot for the bolt. Now let's leave that right there, and we're going to move along to reconnecting in the ABS wire. Slide that in, listen for a click, give it a tug to make sure it's secure. Now we'll just bring this up and into position. Start in that bolt as well. Once they're both started, snug them up. Make sure everything's nice and secure. Now let's get our wheel up on here. Start on all of your lug nuts, then we'll bottom them out, get the wheel back on the ground, and then we'll torque each lug nut to 80 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay friends, we got the car back together. What's left to do now? Now of course you're going to want to make sure that you pump up that brake pedal till it's nice and firm. Typically after that, I like to make sure that I check the brake fluid. It's just how I roll. After that, I would just go ahead and close the hood. I'd take it for a road test and make sure I don't have any funny noises or even an ABS light. Aside from that, make sure you get yourself a 4-wheel alignment. Thanks for watching.